Hey everyone, Coldwater here from Phantom Trading, and welcome to our video on intraday market cycles. Now, much like our video last week on liquidity, this is not a concept that you can just use on its own, but it is a really good tool to use almost as a roadmap for your intraday trading. So if you trade just London session or just New York session or even late New York session, this is a good way to look at the different variations of what potentially could happen during the day, during the session. And obviously we want to combine that with all of our other concepts, our structure and liquidity, as well as supply and demand zones that are high quality, high probability of holding and or getting swept and pushing off in the opposite direction. So let's start by looking at the diagrams, and then I will show you guys a few examples on GBP USD on an actual live chart with a similar, well, basically with the Phantom my session indicator that highlights each of these different sessions. So let's start with variation A. That's the New York reversal. I'll show you guys the short to long variation. Let me actually zoom in here so it's a little clearer. But basically, if you guys watched our Phantom my session indicator, we talk about the different timings, I believe, as well in that video. I'll just quickly recap them here. Obviously, we have the Asia range, which is from 18 o'clock Eastern Standard to 1 o'clock Eastern Standard. So that's basically from, let me do the math here, I believe 6 p.m. to 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So whatever time zone you're in, you'll have to convert it, but the way that the session indicator is set up anyways, you'll have to put it in Eastern Standard Time so that it matches up. So that's our Asia session range. Typically we get a consolidation of price action. There's not a lot of volume in the market, right? It's typically when the BFIs are building liquidity, or you can view it as natural price action in which liquidity is being built, right? And then of course we have Frankfurt open, which is at 2 a.m. Eastern Standard. It is at 7 GMT, which is an hour before London open, right? And typically we'll see a kick in volatility. Not always, but you'll see a small kick in volatility. Typically there's like a risk entry that you can take in and around this time. And you can either scalp it, or in some cases, if it aligns with the direction that London intends to go anyways, you can hold it, right? So Frankfurt, it's a 1 hour little thing. You're opening an hour early, right? In Germany. So there's your volatility there. And then of course we have London open, which is 8 GMT, also known as 3 a.m. my time. Again, I'm in Toronto, so I'm putting everything in EST, and again with the indicator you have to put it in EST anyways, so it would be 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's like the primary, I would say, high volatility hours of London session. A London session obviously lasts a whole 8 hours, right? So there is of course more volatility a little bit later on when London and New York sort of overlap, but this London open, this is where you're going to get like a ton of volatility, and typically we're going to be sweeping the consolidation that happens within Asia session, right? And then we have London lull, which is where there's basically an early lunch in London. There's a slowdown in volatility. Sometimes there are moves at this time, but again, just generally things slow down up until around 7 a.m. Eastern Standard, which is about an hour before New York open, right? The New York Forex open anyways. Then at 8 a.m. we have New York sessions official open in the Forex market. And of course at 9:30 a.m. we have the New York stock market open, which again, you'll typically see volatility kick in at that time, especially for indices and as well for Forex pairs. So that is, those are kind of the main sessions. And then, sorry, I also forgot, we have late New York, which is, I would say from 11 a.m. Eastern Standard to 4 p.m. Eastern. This is where, again, things can move. It's a good time to scalp, sort of, but typically it doesn't move much compared to the primary sessions that I've outlined, right? London and New York are really the main ones. And the reason for that is because the London session closes at about 11 a.m. Eastern. Correct me if I'm wrong. I could be off by an hour or two. But because of that, you now only have New York sessions, volatility. You have New York traders who are coming back from lunch, and there's not going to be much volume in the market or movement. Again, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain situations where, a couple times a month there's huge volatility. Late New York, sometimes there's news that is a catalyst for huge moves in the market, but something to mention. So that's variation 1. Let's look at variation A. Let's look at variation B. This is the New York continuation. So essentially the only difference is you have London make a move, London lull pulls back, and then New York continues that move, right? As opposed to reversing from what London's move was, right? So, we always like to say things like, London was intraday, it was bullish, New York was bearish, right? The session was bearish. You can define any different time period. It could be, the daily's bearish, the 4 hours bearish, the 15 minutes bearish, but you can also use that sort of terminology for, intraday price action, as well as sessions, right? So we could say Asia's ranging, which it typically does, right? And then we have variation C, which is the last one, which is the Asia whipsaw. All this is again, same thing. We're sweeping liquidity from both sides of Asia, essentially, right? And again, Asia doesn't always range, and sometimes liquidity gets swept within the Asian range, kind of negating the need for any of this to happen. But, this is just one of the other variations where Frankfurt's going to sweep maybe the high or the low in the case of a bearish version of the setup. This typically happens in more consolidating markets, right? You'll see the 15 minutes starting to range quite a bit. But anyways, you'll sweep one side of Asia, you'll sweep the other in London, right? And usually that's as a result of London making its main move. And then you'll have some sort of volatility in London lull, and then volatility the other way as New York session pushes back up. Typically it mitigates something in London or sweeps a high, right, in this bearish case, or sweeps a low in the bullish scenario, right? And then we see volatility all throughout New York session up until late New York, right? So now I'm going to show you guys some chart examples. We'll see if we can identify some of them, but I just want to show you guys generally how the market moves based on these different timings. And the nice thing about this is, again, obviously you don't want to use it on its own, but if you recognize one of these patterns, it kind of gives you a game plan. So you have, a plan to actually attack the session that you're trading as it's, developing, right? So let's dive into some live examples on GU, and I'll see you guys in a second. Let me just switch my chart. It's nice and clear. I tried pulling this up on the 15 minutes. Probably hard for you guys to read, and the 1 minute is just a little too noisy. But we'll look at it on the candle chart as well in a second. Just want to show you guys a line chart first. But anyways, the point I was trying to make is there are some subtle sweeps of liquidity. I'll quickly show you guys on the 5 minute what I'm talking about. You have liquidity here that is getting taken within Asia session, and essentially we can almost view this as a sweep and then sort of a push to the downside. I believe even this high gets taken too, right? So these subtle sweeps also qualify in my opinion. In this case it actually holds, but it does sweep this internal range liquidity that's sitting here, right? Frankfurt is not sweeping it. It's actually happening in between London and Frankfurt. Frankfurt kind of pushes down. London comes back, retests a range created supply in Frankfurt, and then we push down for London. London lull consolidates, and then we have New York reversing and taking out these highs. So this is all liquidity to sort of target for later, right? And then we have our late New York session, right? The light pink box, which you can see. There looks like there's a bit of like a scalp that you could have taken. Right? We swept this high. You could have shorted this for maybe 5R, but again, that's why I kind of marked this out as late New York, because you don't really want to be holding trades that you're in if you're going to scalp late in the day. If it's New York or London, okay, it makes sense. You're going to typically see volatility in the move, so that's okay. But yeah, so that's variation A, the New York reversal. Let's find a variation B, New York continuation / Asia midline test, which I forgot to mention in the diagram, but I'll talk about it in a second. Okay, so this is actually, I think, the next day, which is pretty crazy. You actually have this NY continuation / Asia midline test. So again, I'll pop up the diagram so you guys can compare it, but we essentially have a version of this where price consolidates a little bit more. It doesn't move quite as much, but you have Asia that ranges, creates liquidity, right? You have Frankfurt that pushes and sweeps the low. London pushes up. In the case of the actual example I'm going to show you guys, London low actually has more volatility too, so it just kind of continues to push. And then New York comes back down and retests in and around the equilibrium of the Asia range, which is really interesting. So I'll show you guys that. And then obviously it takes off and pushes higher, right? We have late New York, which again consolidates. So let's look at that. Actually, in this case, late New York, I mean, this is just pretty rangy price action, to be honest, but you have right here Asia's range roughly, and then Asia's midline I will mark out here, and see how it retests it, right? So again, what happens? We have Asia ranges. In this case, we sweep liquidity that is built within Asia. We don't necessarily take out this low, and that's okay. It doesn't have to happen. Anything can happen in the market. Rather, it looks like we are respecting Asia's low, right? So Frankfurt doesn't have much of a push. London sort of taps, mitigates this, right? It's weird. We're kind of chaining and compressing, right? In that we are respecting both sides. London pops to the downside, and then right at about an hour and 15 minutes into London session, we pop up, right? That move is sustained throughout the start of London lull, and then price starts to retrace within London lull back to Asia's midline, as I was talking about before, right? And then we can see here we have a nice POI on, in this case this is the 5 minute, but on the 15 minute, we can look at the 15 minute. It's just going to be a little bit messier. We have this large, not really large, but this doji on the 15 minute that could have been used as a POI. And then within New York session, look, we continue to push up, right? Now in this case, we don't close above. Again, it's a very rangy day that we have here, right? It's a Friday, so that would actually kind of explain it. Not that all Fridays are going to be slow, but in this case, right, we can see that we don't close above, we sweep that, and then that would explain why price retraces, right? There wasn't much conviction in this move, right? But again, doesn't mean that we can't take longs from here, right? Let's actually cut price back and just kind of see if there is a valid entry within the way that we trade here. So it looks like this is right around 10. This may have been news. Let me turn on news really quick and just check, right? Because sometimes, oh no, okay, we have economic events on. Let me pull price back a little bit further. Okay, it looks like there was, oh, I don't typically pay attention to new home sales, but it looks like it created some volatility in the market for whatever reason. Not typically a restricted news event for prop firms either. But anyways, this is our 15-minute POI. We can see here that price taps into this extreme. So it looks like there would have been a valid risk entry of a refined 1 minute within a 15-minute POI that you could have taken a long off of, right? And so again, if we are, obviously paying attention to our higher time frame structure, right? We do proper analysis, we pay attention to liquidity, and we tie in this concept of the different variations of what can happen within, the intraday market cycle. This kind of lines up a bunch of, confluences that we can use to confidently throw a limit order or execute market right here, right? And take a risk entry in this case. For me personally, I don't like taking risk entries very much. I take them sometimes, but I prefer, when price comes back and retests this after violating a level of supply on the 1 minute in this case, right? That would have been a more ideal entry for me, right? So let's look for variation C, the Asia whipsaw, and we'll see if we can quickly find that. All right, so finally we have variation C, which again is typically going to happen when the market is consolidating. In this particular day, or on this particular day, there was movement in the market, but not as much as compared to other days, right? In some of these cases, again, high impact news creates huge volatility in the market. You see huge moves, right? But that doesn't mean we can't, look for trade opportunities on slower days like this, right? It's just a matter of using our intraday market cycle as a bit of a roadmap to guide us, right? So in this case, again, I'm going to show you guys the diagram. I'll show you guys the line chart version of this as well, so that the example is a little more clear, because it is very messy, especially here in New York. But let's look at variation C, Asia whipsaw, and I believe in this case we are looking at a bearish scenario. So you know, it's sometimes it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes it'll sweep one way and then the other, and then sweep here again, and then push the other way. So again, it doesn't necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily going to be perfect, right? So in this case, we have Asia ranging, Frankfurt sweeps the low, London sweeps the high. London lull, we take out the low of day again, right? And then New York pushes up and then pushes down again, right? And I think in the case of this real world example, you'll see that in late New York, we actually continue to push lower, right? So this is one of those days where there's more sustained movement later in the day, later in the session, right? So here's our Asia session range, right? We see that Frankfurt pushes down, sweeps the low. In this case, you have London, which comes back and retests this 15-minute POI. Again, I'm on the 5-minute, but I could just see, you know, three 5-minute candles is a 15-minute POI, right? So this here, right? London retests it and then sustains that move down, right? Sweeps this low, right? In this case, it's Frankfurt's low, right? And then we have price reverse intraday, right? So this is our new like low of day. Price reverses intraday. We get a sustained move through London lull, right? And then New York starts to get quite choppy, but we then respect this rough 15-minute zone here, right? As we push higher and eventually sweep Asia's highs, right? And now that we've taken both Asia's highs and Asia's lows, right, we whipsawed, then we can start to see that there is this huge 15-minute zone that price comes and taps, respects, right? We get some violations of demand levels here, we respect it, and then we push lower. And this was really the biggest move of the day, was late New York, right? Like I said, it happens sometimes, right? So it's good to be prepared for any situation that happens. And that's really, you know, the whole point of showing you guys these different intraday market cycles, right? Let's quickly look at this on the 15-minute and see if I was able to mark out my zones accurately based on that. I can't remember where were we? I think we were up here. I think it was June 9th, yeah. So as you guys can see, there you go, there's my 15-minute zone. I think if you want to clean this up a bit, you can just use the wicks. It makes a little bit more sense. And then obviously you have your 15-minute zone here and this 15-minute zone from London, right? So again, tons of opportunities as long as you're able to sort of call, you know, in this case, it is very rangy, like I said, so it is difficult to try and call the market direction. Obviously, we want to be paying attention to what POIs we're tapping into, what the overall structure is, which, by the way, in this case, it actually looks like our 15-minute structure is bullish based on this move, but look, we have bearish order flow, right? And I can tell you guys right now, I believe 4-hour is going to be bearish. If I cut price back to here, and we go on the 4-hour, right, we can see that price is, I would say it's bullish. I mean, it's ranging, right? And then we have bearish order flow, right? Because we're starting to violate these lows, though we are also sweeping them, right? So in one of these rangy markets, you really want to be trying to play the edges anyways, and in this case, you get to do that. So there you go. Those are the three, you know, different market cycle, intraday market cycle variations. I urge you guys to go check it out, see if you can, you know, find some of them on your own. And again, I think this is a great confluence. I use this in my own trading. Obviously, I only trade New York session nowadays. I used to trade London. It killed me trying to stay up that late, or, you know, waking up at like, you know, midnight to trade London for a few hours and then going to bed in the daytime here in the Eastern Standard time zone. But, you know, with this, you know, doesn't matter what you trade. If you trade London, this is obviously a great tool for that. And same for if you trade New York or late New York, right? So I hope you guys learned something new in today's video. If you guys want to learn how to trade the way we trade in Phantom, visit our website, phantomtradingfx.com, where we cover basically everything from A to Z, so you can learn to become a consistently profitable trader. All right, talk to you guys soon, and thanks again for watching. Happy trading.